Good evening, and welcome to the Army Heritage Center Foundation's lecture series for this evening, September 7th, 2022. My name is Jeff Hawks. I'm the Director of Education and Veterans Outreach for the Army Heritage Center Foundation, and I'm filling in today for Mike Perry, who's unable to join us at this time. Tonight's presentation, SUVs Suck in Combat, the Rebuilding of Iraq During a Raging Insurgency, is brought to us by Kerry, Kachejian, who has served as a soldier, an engineer, and defense industry executive, and an award-winning author and motivational speaker. He is a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point with a concentration in aerospace engineering and an MS degree from Virginia Tech in systems engineering. He is also a distinguished graduate of the Industrial College of the Armed Forces, earning an MS degree in natural resource strategy. He is a registered professional engineer. He is also a retired Army Reserve colonel who's airborne and Ranger qualified. His service includes relief operations during Hurricane Katrina and a supporting reconstruction operations in both Iraq and Afghanistan. In Iraq, he played a key leadership role in the establishment of the Gulf Region Division, which undertook the largest, most complex, and most dangerous reconstruction mission in our nation's history. His military decorations include the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star Medal, and the Combat Action Badge. Mr. Kachejian has over 30 years of industry experience, including assignments in operations, program management, business development, and strategy in the defense, intelligence, and homeland security markets at GE Aerospace, Systems Planning Corporations, E-Systems, Raytheon, Bold Solutions, Harris Corporation, and CAIC International. He has spoken at a number of major conferences, media events for C-SPAN, Heritage Foundation, Huffington Post Live, radio outlets, and private events on topics including the reconstruction of Iraq and Afghanistan, the psychology of terrorism, contractors on the battlefield, America at risk, and critical infrastructure protection. He is also the author of two books. One is The Paperboy, The Best Entry-Level Jobs in America, and the book that is the title and subject of tonight's talk, SUVs Suck in Combat, the Rebuilding of Iraq During a Raging Insurgency. We're very pleased that he has joined us today to share his knowledge and expertise. So, Kerry, please.
All right, Jeff, thank you for that kind introduction. I also want to thank the Army Heritage Center Foundation in general, and specifically Mike Perry for extending this invitation. So it's always rewarding to share stories with fellow veterans and patriots and to learn from each other. This story is a very different side of the war in Iraq. The rebuilding of Iraq during a raging insurgency was a much less visible mission and was often misunderstood or mischaracterized in the news media. So tonight, I'm going to tell you, and more importantly, I'm going to show you what really happened in 2004 and describe some of the daunting challenges we faced as the Iraqi insurgency kicked off. So we're going to step back in time and onto a chaotic battlefield. We're going to relive some of the blood, sweat, and tears from that period in our Army's history. So let's get at this. So we lost scores of teammates in our operations while I was in Iraq, and some were military. Many others were civilians or contractors that were part of our team. So I'm dedicating this presentation to four of them that I was personally close with, and I wish I had them back. So Heinrich Visage, we called him Fish. He was one of our security contractors. He was killed by a rocket-propelled grenade during an ambush in Fallujah. Michael Downey was a distant cousin, and he died of wounds from sniper fire. Sunil Hadi was one of our interpreters. Her vehicle plunged in the Tigris River. I tried to save her, and I failed. And Charlie Driscoll was our teammate, airborne Ranger in West Point class in 1995. So during this presentation, I'm going to familiarize you with our reconstruction mission and operations. I'm going to provide you an overview of the critical infrastructure that was at the center of this fight. We're going to discuss force protection issues that arise when you introduce thousands of contractors on the battlefield. And this includes our insane dependence on unarmored SUVs. And if time permits, we'll discuss some of the lessons learned that we don't want to repeat in places like the Ukraine or North Korea or other potential future conflict zones. So I was at the National Defense University when our nation was attacked on 9/11. This is the view we had of the Pentagon looking out the fourth floor window of Eisenhower Hall. Soon thereafter, we were in 2 wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and there were strategic reconstruction missions in both countries. But tonight, I'm only going to focus on Iraq. Now, ironically, people are already discussing a Marshall Plan for the Ukraine, so this lecture may be very timely. This chart reflects the military organization in Iraq in 2004 under the Multinational Forces Iraq, MNFI, General Casey. There were 4 major subordinate commands: the Multinational Security Transition Command, MNSTICI, on the left. That had to organize and train and equip the new Iraqi military and the new Iraqi police. And that was led by General Petraeus. The next was the Multinational Corps Iraq, MNCI, and they led the combat fight. And that included a few dozen of our coalition forces partners, and that was led by Lieutenant General Metz. On the right side was the Iraq Survey Group. They had the WMD mission in Iraq. Now, the Gulf Region Division, the GRD, is in the red dotted box. That was rapidly created as a provisional command to rebuild Iraq. It was initially led by Major General Ron Johnson and later by Brigadier General Tom Bostic. I served in this unit as the GRD G3, running the division operations while also keeping General Casey, Metz, and Petraeus informed of our progress during the daily battlefield update briefings. Now, in the top left of this chart, you'll see a Iraq Reconstruction Management Office, IRMO. That was in the U.S. Embassy, and they handled the political engagement with the interim Iraqi government and the U.S.-led coalition. Now, the U.S. government decided to rebuild Iraq after the invasion in 2003. And normally, the military trains to fight and win wars, and then it goes home. And in this case, the mission extended into stability and reconstruction operations, which we typically do not train for in warfighting exercises. The State Department declined to lead the reconstruction mission as they were still ongoing combat operations. So the reconstruction mission fell largely on DoD, but it was a team effort involving the embassy, the Iraqi ministries for oil, electricity, defense, interior, and education. USAID was in it, the NGOs, and the Army Corps of Engineers, which was a primary Army contribution, and it performed most of the effort via the Gulf Region Division, the GRD. The mission started with 2,300 projects, but over time, the list grew to over 5,000. Projects spanned across all sectors of the Iraqi national infrastructure: the oil, the electrical, the security, the health, transportation, government facilities. Each dot on this map represents a separate reconstruction project, and they were spread throughout a hostile country. And on the bottom right, the Baghdad inset map, it's saturated with hundreds of other projects located in the nation's capital. This was an unbelievable mission. It was daunting in its scale and scope, and it was the largest, most complex, and most dangerous mission of its kind ever attempted in our nation's history. The urgent mission to rebuild Iraq meant there was little time to stand up the Gulf Region Division and get it into the fight. So GRD stood up. It had no military units, first of all. They exist to rebuild countries. So the GRD was stood up rapidly. It was organized, staffed, equipped, trained, and deployed in only a couple of months. Most of the GRD team were recruited from across the nation, and we met each other for the first time in combat during a dangerous insurgency. Some of us realized that the rapid stand-up and response had all the potential to be another Task Force Smith. But with a small cadre of capable military officers leading the mission, we were able to get boots on the ground and begin the full spectrum of operations, from tactical to strategic. So GRD would serve as the non-lethal fire in the coalition strategy to stabilize Iraq. So armed with GRD, a maneuver commander now had the power not only to destroy the enemy, but also to employ the enemy. So GRD was a provisional division activated in January 2004. It only had 10% military at most. They were mostly Army Corps of Engineers and reservists. 90% of the force were civilians. They came from DOD. They were industry contractors. They were Iraqis. And because we showed up to the war late, there were no spare military vehicles, no spare military radios, no crew served weapons. And we had a force cap on soldiers. We could not get many soldiers into our division. We only had a handful. So we began the mission. We could not adequately protect our people, communicate with other military forces. We had no crew served weapons to defend our convoys or project sites. But GRD had money. And so we used money as a weapon system. So we bought or leased about everything. This included 200 sport utility vehicles from Kuwait. 188 of them were unarmored. They provided little protection from enemy attacks. And we were dependent on security contractors to protect the project sites and to protect the civilians as they fought their way on the road moving between project sites. Things got better over time, but there were many lessons learned that should not be forgotten. So I became involved in this mission because my Army Reserve Unit, the Contingency Response Unit, trained for disaster missions involving the Army Corps of Engineers. These events often included hurricanes, earthquakes, and floods. But when the Iraq wartime mission extended into stability and reconstruction, my CENTCOM team in the bottom right was recalled to active duty to serve as the operations cadre across the country. Each of us stepped out of our civilian jobs in industry and government to deploy in Iraq, and we put on our uniforms. So on the bottom right, there's guys like Baghdad Bob Cabell, stepped out of AT&T and was an Army major in combat. Hal Creel, DOD civilian. Chris Kolditz, a USACE civilian. Charlie Driscoll from Battelle. I came out of Raytheon. Scott Loudermilk was a USACE civilian. Everybody had another full-time job, and it was time to put on the uniform, salute, and execute. So I served as the division operations officer in Baghdad. The rest of the team were dispersed in places like Ramadi, Basra, and Mosul. The photo on the left shows General Sanchez standing up the GRD with Major General Johnson in a ceremony in Baghdad. Now, at the same time this was happening, there were a lot of strategic events happening across Iraq. First, the coalition was transferring power back to the Iraqis. Second, we were preparing the country for national elections. Third, Minstiki was organizing and equipping the Iraqi military and police, building the capacity so they could defend themselves. And we were also at the same time putting Saddam and his regime on trial. The success of these strategic events were often dependent on our own reconstruction projects that we led. Now, a little bit more background before we dive into the mission. Iraq is a complex and complicated place, particularly during a war. There are several different religions, tribes, ethnic groups, and enemies. We had to learn really fast because our survival depended on what we knew. On a typical day in Iraq, U.S. combat forces were involved in 70 to 110 attacks, and the Reconstruction War had its own daily battles. I can only remember a few days during my tour when our project sites, personnel, or convoys were not attacked in some way. Attacks came from every conceivable form. Improvised explosive devices, IEDs, rockets, mortars, small arms fire, sniping, kidnappings, beheadings, repair crews ambushed, and workers threatened. In 2004, we had 3 clear enemies in Iraq, and we termed them anti-Iraqi forces, AIF. They were the former Ba'ath Party loyalists, the Shia militiamen, and the Al-Qaeda terrorists. And you could tell which enemy was attacking you by how they did it. Some enemy attackers were in it for money or power. Some were just criminals, and others were terrorists. All 3 enemies found our reconstruction operations relatively easy targets. The Baathists were former Sunni regime loyalists, loyal to Saddam. They were tactically competent, and they often set up well-planned ambushes and drive-by shootings in BMWs. They would then disengage so they could live to fight another day. The Shia militiamen were often loyal to Muqtada al-Sadr, Sometimes they were called the Mahdi militia or the Mahdi army. Many of them felt aligned with Iran. The Shia had less tactical training, and they would take unnecessary risks, often believing their faith would protect them from harm or death, or would make them a martyr. So if a fighter stood in the street, totally exposed with an AK or an RPG pointed at you, it was probably a Shia militiaman. Their tactics and marksmanship were generally poor, but they often died young, and they did so with style. Exposed Shia fighters would quickly draw small arms fire and sniper fire from U.S. forces. For a few weeks, the Mahdi army wore white armbands as their uniform to distinguish them as an organized fighting force. That made targeting them much easier. The third enemy in Iraq was Al-Qaeda Iraq. They were mostly foreign-born terrorists who came to Iraq to fight Americans. Al-Qaeda probably numbered in the low thousands at their peak strength, but their effectiveness far exceeded their numbers. Al-Qaeda Iraq teamed with and paid other Iraqi groups to attack Americans. The core Al-Qaeda members were ruthless and evil. They were not cowards. They were totally committed and willing to die. They slaughtered many innocent Iraqis that got in their way. They bombed markets, schools, and mosques to inflict widespread fear. They had a propaganda arm and posted videos on the internet of beheadings and executions. They were unbelievably inhumane and proud of it. Their senseless cruelty was later rejected by the Sunnis, who eventually turned on AQI. We knew we were up against Al-Qaeda if a car bomb drove up next to our convoy and detonated, or if soon after we completed a reconstruction of a school, all the teachers were murdered in front of their students. Drivers of reconstruction convoys were kidnapped by AQI and beheaded. And if the owner of an Iraqi construction company under contract to the United States was followed home and murdered along with his family, it was probably at the hands of Al-Qaeda. Now, in the north of Iraq, in that yellow area, that's where the Kurds are. They are an ethnic group, and they were generally very supportive of the Americans. So Iraq was a complicated place. Iraq's environment and terrain also varied greatly. There was heat, cold, desert, floods, sand, snow, mud. From coastal ports to marshland to icy mountains, our reconstruction projects had to span it all. Now, the GRD was in the green zone, the headquarters, the division headquarters, a few miles east of the Baghdad airport. At the top left of this screen, to get there, you had to drive across the most dangerous highway in the world. GRD occupied the Iraqi White House in the top right. It's really a brown palace. In early 2004, it was located on the Tigris River. We were later evicted by Prime Minister Alawi, who wanted his historical residence back when he assumed leadership for the country. Within a few hours of arriving at the GRD headquarters, a vehicle-borne IED, a VBID, destroyed the nearby Mount Lebanon Hotel, driving us across the room and into the walls and killing scores of people. In this photo, the hotel is gone with only a 20-foot crater remaining. That shockwave and mushroom cloud were part of my Welcome to Baghdad reception, and it shaped my appreciation for force protection. Let's take a closer look at the reconstruction mission and the security challenges. So to rebuild a country, we needed U.S. industry, particularly the large architectural and engineering firms, the A&E firms, who were a critical part of the team. Contracts were rapidly awarded based on infrastructure sectors, and the winners were often required to provide their own logistics, their own communications, and their own security contractors in a combat environment. So security at project sites often added 30% to the total cost. Now, GRD's mission started after the contract was awarded and funded. Our job was to build the project on the ground in the country. We had to get her done. Here are some of the early reconstruction leaders. Admiral Nash from the embassy on the left side, Brigadier General Tom Bostic from GRD in the center, and Charlie Hess, who was an SES from the Corps of Engineers on the right. Now, the first major sector of Iraq's national infrastructure was the electrical grid. The electrical grid was a critical part of Iraq's political and economic stability. Our mission was to get electricity flowing again. This photo shows some of the major power plants and transmission lines that were strategic projects, and their progress was reported up the chain of command to MNFI and to the Secretary of Defense daily. Unlike the Ukraine, there were no nuclear power plants, generation plants in Iraq. Now, Saddam was a Sunni, and he used electricity as a weapon. He denied power to the Shia to punish them. So under Saddam, there were islands of electrical power, particularly in Sunni areas, available in Iraq, and that primarily benefited his political base. Now, GRD had to increase the amount of electrical generation capacity across the country, and then had to distribute it to areas that were previously denied power. Progress happened regularly, but due to poor communications and political agendas, it was sometimes impossible to get timely, accurate information on the status of a generation project. And while GRD successfully put more power on the Iraqi grid and distributed to the local cities, other Reconstruction partners, other nations, other organizations were supposed to then connect the neighborhoods up to the new power lines that we ran. Well, often that didn't happen. And so many local Iraqi men took matters in their own hands, and they would climb a nearby power line to hook up their own homes. So in Sadr City, this resulted in many dead Iraqi men being electrocuted in the streets in the mornings when you went around and did patrols. They would drop dead trying to connect an electrical line up to a major power transmission line to get their house going. Security issues with electricity. So the security of the power generation plants and the transmission lines was a constant issue. All linear infrastructure was hard to protect. Things that are long and narrow, like power lines, oil pipelines, roads, rail lines, borders, fiber optic cables, they're all linear features. Insurgents used every means possible to slow us down. So the enemy's goal was to disrupt our projects and our progress, to discredit the Americans and the new Iraqi government. In many cases, the insurgents would blow up a newly installed power line. There were simply not enough guards to protect all the new towers. Looters would often walk out and cut down power lines and then sell it for scrap metal to make a living. So we had good days and we had bad days. And although the Minister of Electricity had a police security force, we found it was simply easier to repair damaged power lines than to try to guard everything. Again, there was a force cap. In response, our nation was flying in aircraft. They were flying into Iraq, rapid repair towers from the United States. And the supply of these towers ran perilously low. Another incident when a contractor convoy that was transporting critical experts that were needed to commission new Iraqi power generation plants. When that convoy was attacked in Baghdad, we were unaware for several days that they were even hit. Some of the contractors were killed. Some had to flee on foot across the city. General Electric made a corporate decision to leave the battlefield due to their grave security concerns. That led to a strategic negotiations in Amman, Jordan, and the personal pledge by Major General Kerry, the 1st Cav Division commander, that he would use every asset he had to protect the Reconstruction mission. Oil. It was the most important part of the Iraqi economy. Iraq's was the world's 2nd largest known oil reserves. 95% of the GNP income in Iraq was from oil. Without this income, Iraq could not pay its military, its police, its teachers, or run its government. Now, there were 2 distinct oil fields in Iraq. One was in the southern oil fields near Kuwait, and the other was the northern oil fields near Kirkuk. And when Saddam and the Baathists, when they lost the war, they lost their professional jobs. They lost control of the military. They lost their pensions, and any income that they would get out of the Iraqi oil fields. Ba'athist had nothing to lose and everything to gain to get the Americans out of Iraq. This chart shows several of the major oil refineries and pipelines in Iraq. Now, oil pipelines were a favorite enemy target. Pipelines were very long and often located in remote areas. Insurgents knew the infrastructure and where and when to best attack it to maximize damage. The largest oil export terminal in Iraq was in the Arabian Gulf, and it was attacked by 2 suicide boat bombs. The only U.S. Coast Guardsman killed in Iraq was on the USS Firebolt during the attack. I was on duty. Insurgents would intentionally destroy an important valve or a key component as part of the attack to make the repairs more difficult. Like power lines, it was easier to repair pipelines than it was to protect them. However, the enemy knew civilian repair teams would be coming soon after to make the necessary repairs. And these repair crews would also be attacked by IEDs, ambushes, and kidnappings. And after a few of your civilian repair crews are killed, you will not get many more volunteers for future repair missions. So we responded by sending a military team out to attack on an oil pipeline first, to survey the damage, to get photos, to understand what parts were needed, to secure the routes in and out so the repair crew wouldn't be attacked, and to secure the repair site. Now, we're all working 20-hour days, no second shift. We're exhausted, and we're using radios for communication. One team was given the wrong grid coordinates to Recon, a military team, and they wound up lost. They could not find an oil pipeline that was on fire, which you should see for miles. So they decided to go into an Iraqi village, a local village, and ask for directions. They blew in a couple Humvee gunships, and they spooked a guard. And in the process of all the Iraqis fleeing while the Americans were simply looking for instructions, somebody came running out of a hut in a scruffy beard, no shoes, a gunshot wound to the arm, screaming, "I'm an American, I'm an American." He was a hostage who was going to be sold off to Al-Qaeda and beheaded on a video. And so because we gave the guys the wrong grid coordinates, the bad information, they accidentally, unintentionally rescued a hostage. You just can't make this stuff up. Now, in the course of all the pipeline security issues, on top of all of that, many Iraqi farmer families that live near pipelines would simply go up to the pipelines, drill a hole in it, and tap it, fill up some bladder so they could go sell it or help their family make a living. Now, during the war, the Air Force bombed the Al Fatah Bridge to prevent Saddam's forces from attacking north into Kurdistan. You're looking at a photo of that bridge. Now, the targeting guys who decided to hit the bridge, they either didn't talk to or they didn't take advice from the infrastructure guys, because this bridge contained the key oil export lines that left Iraq and went to Turkey. As a result, 1/3 of Iraq's economy was damaged when the oil pipelines were severed inside the bridge. If you take a look at the left side of that bridge and those little conduits that run in the middle of the bridge, you'll see oil pipelines that are actually melted and draped down into the river. Now, the reconstruction mission also included key highway bridges as part of the main supply routes. One key bridge was guarded by American Marines for several months. The day after the security of the bridges was turned over to the Iraqis, the bridge was destroyed by insurgents. This photo shows an attack on an Iraqi bridge. Note, there was an unexploded bomb from Saudi Arabia that was left in the bridge. It failed to detonate. So the question is, how do insurgents get their hands on this bomb? Rail lines were another part of the Iraqi infrastructure, and they did not escape the war. Fiber optic cables were also targeted. Now, clean water and sanitation was a visible improvement that Iraqis could see and greatly appreciate. Sadr City was a Shia slum in Baghdad with over 2 million residents. There were open sewers in the streets. That's what you're looking at. I flew over this one day at about 5,000 feet, and it was overpowering the odor at that height. Now, American forces, led by Colonel Abrams, who had a BCT, a Brigade Combat Team, in Sadr City, his BCT was attacked over 100 times per week. Now, I know him. He's a classmate and friend of mine from the military academy. I hadn't seen him in years until we reunited in Baghdad. So his boss was Major General Kerry, 1st Cav Division Commander. General Kerry wanted to team with GRD, and the strategy was to hire thousands of Iraqis to build sewer systems and the electrical pumps needed to run them, to clean up the streets. So thousands of military-aged men picked up shovels and took a job to make a living. This meant that men were no longer in the recruitment pool of insurgents. The strategy worked. The spike in employment resulted in Sadr City attacks dropping from over 100 a week to under 10 per week, which is a 90% reduction. Now, the Reconstruction workforce strategy was to use the maximum manual labor for projects to give Iraqi men a job so they would not join the insurgents. On average, 155,000 Iraqi men took jobs with the United States rather than work for the insurgents. When experts pointed out that we could build projects faster and more efficiently with heavy equipment, we would politely remind them that more construction equipment would likely result in more unemployed men and more insurgents. Attacks on reconstruction projects were often underreported or reported late. Consequently, the attacks did not show up in the daily significant activities report seen by commanders. As a result, the war on reconstruction was often invisible to the maneuver forces. This chart illustrates the attacks that we were aware of during 1 month period. That's August of 2004. Attacks took all forms. Sometimes a project site would have 300 workers on Monday, and only 15 workers would show up on Wednesday. We later learned that the terrorists published the names of everyone supporting the Americans in the local mosque and threatened to kill the workers and their families if they did not immediately quit their job. So we stopped, obviously, publishing photos of Iraqi workers to protect their identities. In some cases, owners of Iraqi construction companies that supported us would be hunted down and killed in front of their families. So in another notable case, I might have mentioned it earlier, but we completed a school for Iraqi girls, and then we put out a press release to announce our success. The insurgents responded by killing all the teachers. So as you can imagine, publicly reporting our success was often resulted in an enemy attack, so we often could not publicly claim what has been accomplished. This chart captures some of the casualties incurred on our operations. It was the contractors that suffered the highest casualties, as many lacked any intelligence on enemy locations. They did not have interoperable communications on the battlefield, and they were not protected by maneuver forces. So just knowing if the road threat level status is red would have been incredibly helpful for many of these convoys, so they could have avoided it and avoided attacks. Now, of course, things got better over time. The reconstruction got more integrated with the maneuver forces. And I'm talking to you about 2004. And over the course of the mission, many hundreds of personnel were lost, and sadly, some of their bodies were never recovered. Now, borders were critically important for GRD logistics. We had to get reconstruction supplies and materials from other countries. However, there were many security issues at these borders. An Iraqi border guard was often very poorly paid, so bribery was pervasive. More border guards did not mean more security. The smuggling of weapons, fuel, people, drugs, scrap metal was pervasive. Ironically, we built hundreds of border forts on the Syrian border on the left. The Iraqi guards were still undergoing training, and they did not immediately occupy the new border forts. However, the Syrian border guards liked these new facilities, and they moved into the new Iraqi forts. Now, this chart is at the top. You see a red line, which is a river that separates Turkey from Iraq. There's a 20-mile long line of traffic going into Turkey and going into Iraq on both sides because of the security and smuggling issues. Let me just give you one illustration. On the Iraq side, gasoline is 8 cents a gallon. On the Turkish side, it's $4 a gallon. Now, these are 2004 prices. Can you think of a way Iraqis might try to make money? It would be obviously smuggling fuel. There was also the smuggling of scrap metal, the drug flow, the people flow. The Turks were worried about insurgents. So it was just a complex issue. And I actually took these photos from a helicopter flying in, and it was just unbelievable to see a 20-mile long traffic jam, and it moved very slowly. So another mission the Corps of Engineers had in Iraq, their Huntsville Center, was destroying all of the captured enemy ammunition, CEA. There was 10 times more ordnance in Iraq than in the rest of the Middle East combined. We had to collect it, secure it, and destroy it, and the mission took years. Unfortunately, these CEA sites were not always guarded by reliable U.S. forces. Some allies had the security mission, but they only guarded the site during daylight. That allowed insurgents to steal ammunition at night. The CEA sites were a great source of materials for IEDs. Our team destroyed up to 1,000 tons per day. That was a huge number, and that would be the entire country. And it was a 3-year mission. 1,000 tons a day was not typical, but that was the largest day I heard. And it started getting personal because these artillery rounds were used as an IED to take out my vehicle. So we were all motivated. And I'll show you some photos of IED attacks on our Reconstruction personnel in a few minutes. And when enemy ammunition was captured, we tried to remove it for destruction to a safe location. Due to safety issues and local insurgent activities, sometimes the ammunition had to be destroyed in place in the town, wherever it was found. Force protection. So previously I mentioned that we were dependent on security contractors to protect our ground movements and to protect the project sites. In this photo, it shows a typical convoy team with a mix of GRD military and security contractors. They're standing in front of the SUVs used for convoy operations. Most of our SUVs were not armored. We leased 200 from Kuwait. 188 were thin-skinned commercial vehicles just like this one. Iraqi insurgents would often attack our convoys from the rear by flying up in BMWs at over 110 miles an hour. To prevent these surprise attacks, we removed the SUV tailgates, and we put a security contractor in the rear with a Russian PKM machine gun to serve as a tail gunner to provide rear security. We could not issue, nor did we have U.S. weapons, crew-served weapons, to give to security contractors. So as the G3, I authorized the use of Russian weapons that could be locally acquired along with the ammunition. Note, the personal body armor that is draped outside the vehicle to provide some small level of protection for the occupants. This is how our security teams rolled This is how they armored themselves for combat. There weren't enough troops available in the GRD to guard our civilian personnel, so we heavily relied on these security contractors. We did not look like a first-rate military force. Again, you see body armor on the sides of the SUV to try to stop some of the incoming rounds. Again, you see the tailgate and the tail gunner with the Russian PKM machine gun to stop the rear drive-by attacks. For communications, we used ad hoc commercial communications, HF radios and SATCOM radios. They were not interoperable with the rest of the military, but we could talk to each other. Let me tell you, Toyota Land Cruisers suck in combat. These 6-cylinder diesels were slow accelerating, and the sheet metal did not stop enemy fire. So our SUVs look like lambs in the eyes of the enemy. To protect ourselves, we drove at high speed, often 110 miles an hour, as fast as we possibly could, and we would abruptly change lanes every few seconds to try to throw off the timing of a potential IED. So driving in Iraq was very much like living in a Mad Max movie. Armor protection in Iraq was essential, particularly when the enemy gets the first shot, up close. Unfortunately, our reconstruction vehicles often lack that protection. In this attack, it shows an unarmored SUV on the left and a factory armored SUV on the right, both caught in the same ambush, and both were destroyed. "95% of our SUVs weren't armored. None had the radios to communicate with the military. This was not the proper vehicle for an insurgency. And when I tried to buy armored vehicles with all the money we had to protect our division, I was told it was illegal. We could only lease combat vehicles. That was the law. And few suppliers would agree to lease a combat vehicle in a combat zone. So reconstruction vehicles often drove as fast as they could and made erratic changes in direction, popped U-turns when necessary. And unfortunately, because of our high speed, trying to flee an enemy, we were perceived by US forces, thought we were potential suicide bombers coming at them at a checkpoint. So friendly fire, we took our share, and friendly fire ain't friendly. There were a lot of AKs running around in Iraq. Sometimes we found them. The enemy was innovative in their attacks. During a drive-by rolling ambush, sometimes an enemy shooter would pop up from under a tarp in the back of a pickup truck and spray your vehicle with 30 rounds. One day, I sent a convoy to Taji, and a half hour later, I watched the team live on CNN being engaged by enemy machine gun fire from an overpass. And when we would return fire when we could, but realized that whether you had when you had an SUV, you did not have firing ports. So you could not return fire from inside a vehicle where you had no firing ports, particularly if it was factory armored. So our primary mission was to safely transport experts to project sites. And consequently, we would often break contact and try to continue to our destination. Here's a case where body armor saved our guys. One round in the back only resulted in a contusion. Another round on the right side hit the guy in the neck, hit the collar, and the round split and fell on the top of his vest. So in addition to wearing your body armor, make sure you eat your Wheaties. Any major loss of civilian personnel for our reconstruction mission would put our national mission at risk. Additional civilian experts simply would not volunteer to deploy. They get a vote on the battlefield and whether or not they attend the war. The vehicle armor situation was very bad, and we went on the internet and purchased aftermarket armor kits for our SUVs. We flew the kits into Baghdad, and we set up a chop shop to modify our leased SUVs. These kits were expensive. They grossly overloaded the vehicles. The brakes and suspensions failed after a few months of excess weight. The extra 2,000 pounds meant the SUVs accelerated like a wounded turtle. But as an interim solution, these kits kept the mission going. The aftermarket armor kit pictured here took about a dozen rounds in its first real combat test. The IEDs threat was pervasive. The top left photo here is a vehicle that's factory hardened, or it's also called a hard car. It survived an IED detonation. The occupants were largely protected from the blast and fragments. Other SUVs pictured here were completely destroyed by IEDs, further illustrating why SUVs suck in combat. As you can see, hard cars are valuable, but they are also very difficult to procure in a war during combat. They've already all been bought and committed. There's nothing left. And the ones you get might look like a big black shiny SUV, like a limousine, and it screamed VIP inside, and that made them bullet magnets. So if your employees must drive around in combat zones, I recommend you acquire early, ahead of time, low profile hard cars. Now, my SUV was taken out by an IED, but I survived because it was a hardened SUV. But the vehicle in front of us was further from the blast. It was not hardened, and it was a combat loss. I had no military radio at the time of the attack, so the only way I could report the attack was via an Iraqi cell phone. It wasn't secure, but it was operationally necessary. This is the remnant of one of our GRD vehicles attacked by a drive-by suicide bomber who used 5 to 7 artillery shells as his explosive payload. Having over 2,300 projects to execute meant our teams were constantly on the move. Every day we had to put convoys on the road, and I felt personally responsible for their safety. We took every precaution possible. We would pre-brief people on missions. We rehearsed them, the movements, the numbers of vehicles, how many shooters we had, how we would communicate, the routes, actions on enemy contact. I mentioned before, when my vehicle got taken out, one of the reasons it was probably targeted was that I had a big whip antenna on it, a commercial HF antenna, which made us look like a C2 vehicle, command and control vehicle. And fortunately, we survived it. But another consideration there is, if you're going to use SUVs and you want to look low profile, you can't have a high profile whip antenna hanging off the bumper. My friend, Ben Benner, is on a stretcher here, and he and his airness security team used this vehicle to block a VBID from attacking the next vehicle in the convoy, which contained the GRN, the Gulf Region North Commander, an Army colonel. So they took the brunt of the blast to protect the rest of the convoy and the VIP. Unfortunately, contractors do not receive military awards for valor. In an attack near Mosul, insurgents posted photos like this after they hunted one of our SUVs. Hopefully, our intel guys used facial recognition algorithms to hunt these insurgents down. So my team urgently was trying to acquire the right vehicles for our reconstruction operations, and SUVs were not the answer. So our G3 shop conducted a hasty requirements analysis to determine what kind of vehicle we needed and how many were required. And there were very few acceptable armored vehicles immediately available on the global market. We were able to order a few, but the lead time was months, and they arrived well after I redeployed. So reconstruction during an insurgency requires vehicles with features like the one shown here. These were the actual vehicles we were able to acquire. They were called werewolves. And we used these to rebuild some of the most hostile areas like in Fallujah and Baghdad. So these were dubbed, quote, the werewolves of Baghdad. And on several occasions, they saved the lives of our people. Protecting our project sites and bed down locations was another big force protection challenge. I previously noted that on the first day in Iraq, we were hit with a 1,000-pound car bomb. It was a great force protection lesson learned early, and that experience really helped shape my thinking. So at our project sites, they were all vulnerable to enemy disruption. So we conducted a good vulnerability analysis at each site to determine how the enemy would likely attack us and how to best protect us and protect the workforce. However, the security of project sites was, again, by contract, the responsibility of the prime contractor, and this resulted in multiple contractor security forces that sometimes spoke different languages. The guard forces lacked standardized weapons, ammunition, training, and procedures. They had limited communications interoperability with other guard forces and with coalition military forces, like when they had to call for a quick reaction force. Furthermore, the project site leaders, usually as civilians, needed to individually coordinate with local military units for emergency support. So if you needed a QRF, you needed to go make your own arrangements. Fortunately, my team, my military team, spread around Iraq, played a big role in helping those connections happen. I have multiple other stories. Time doesn't permit me to tell them about things that happened, including attack on Al-Qaeda, where I got an email one day, all bold, all caps, please save our ass, or words to that effect. And it was one of our project sites about to be overrun, 200 civilians on it by militiamen. That was a wild ride. Okay. When two VBIDs drove past the main gate at one of the projects we had, an Iraqi army base at Al-Qaeda, they drove straight for the headquarters building and the DFAC. When they detonated, 5,000 Iraqi green troops fled the base. U.S. contractors at the project site picked up weapons to re-secure the perimeter. In some cases, the perimeter of our project sites needed both landside and waterside security measures. In this photo, there were multiple threats from VBIDs, from suicide boat bombs, from rockets and snipers. When the enemy could not fight their way into a garrison or a project site, they would often hit us with indirect fire, rockets and mortars. The top left shows an expedient enemy rocket launcher with a battery. At the bottom right, many of our personnel lived in trailers that had a sandbag or concrete walls to keep shrapnel from slicing through the sides. However, there was little protection on the roof from a direct hit from a rocket or a mortar, or even celebratory fire, which sometimes plunged down through the roof. If a rocket dropped in your hooch, your time was up. The bottom left, fortunately, many rounds failed to explode on impact, but that resulted in a large number of unexploded rockets inside our perimeter. I slept near an unexploded rocket for several weeks before it was finally removed. Now, the Ba'ath Party headquarters, also known as Believer's Palace, was a top target during the Iraq War. It was hit by several U.S. precision-guided munitions, PGMs. One of them reportedly failed to detonate. I think there were like 6 entrance holes and five craters, something like that. The palace above was destroyed, but the Iraqi command and control bunker underneath suffered limited damage. Our structural experts studied this bunker design, so we could better understand how it performed. You can see the PGM holes that were made in the palace roof here. Photos from inside the Iraqi Republican National Guard bunker are pictured here, and the stairwell taking you down from the main palace into the bunker. I wanted to take over this bunker when we got evicted by the Iraqi Prime Minister from the Iraqi White House. We were looking for a new place to seat the division. I wanted to use the bunker as a division headquarters to protect our people from additional V-bids and rockets. We could clean it up. We were the Corps of Engineers. We had a lot of money. We could get it looking good fast. However, I could not convince the civilians to stay in a bunker with had potentially an unexploded bomb in it. Imagine that. So there were inside this bunker, there were chemical suits, gas masks, atropine injectors inside. You can see some of them on the floor in the bottom right. The Iraqis inside clearly believed that they were in a chemical warfare environment. Also, the bunker was a small underground city, complete with air filtration, electrical generation, and fire suppression systems. The blueprints in the bunker indicated that many of our allies were helping the Iraqis build these bunkers. Another interesting twist that we saw. So let me do this. There's many more stories I can tell. I got 1,000 stories. Most of them are true. In fact, all of them are true. Let me wrap this presentation up. It was clear that many of the Iraqis were thrilled to have us in Iraq to rebuild their country. Privately, they have expressed that in tears. However, they would rarely make any public comments for fear for their personal safety. Years later, after we pulled out of Iraq, ISIS brutally took over significant territory, and they set back many of the gains that we made. Now, ISIS is now beaten back, but I am not sure how much of the American investment we made in Iraq infrastructure is still in use today. I hope the lessons we learned rebuilding Iraq are remembered and thoughtfully considered, as I know there are people right now already planning how to rebuild the Ukraine and perhaps other destroyed nations. And this was the best day we had in 2004 when our teams came home at Dulles Airport. If any of you would like to learn more about the Iraq Reconstruction mission during an insurgency, it's unfiltered. You can find it in this book, SUV Suck in Combat, The Rebuilding of Iraq During a Raging Insurgency. Thank you, and I am available for questions.
All right, Kerry, thank you very much. We do have a few questions in the Q&A box. If anybody has any questions they'd like to ask, please go ahead and type them there. I will read them and sometimes paraphrase them. So the first question we have is referring to the work that the Air Force did before you arrived. And if you might comment on the destruction of the vital infrastructure during the invasion and what you might recommend in the future as far as that destruction is concerned.
Okay, I think you're talking about the Al Fatah Bridge. So I wasn't there when the decision was made, but I was the cleanup on aisle 9. We had to figure out how to get the oil flowing again across the bridge. Let me go to that picture if I could. Right there. Okay. So, obviously the tactical guys were worried about the Iraqis fleeing north, the Iraqi army possibly drawing the Kurds into the war. I'm not sure all of the considerations, but they decided they had to drop this bridge to keep Iraqi forces from moving north into Kurdistan. I would assume they would normally coordinate with the infrastructure guys. I don't know what kind of infrastructure picture they had. I'm sure in 2004, it certainly wasn't as good as it is now. But we have to realize that when we want to go destroy something, that if we're going to intend to occupy it later, if we're going to intend to reuse it later, the secondary and tertiary impacts. Do you know how long it took to rebuild this bridge? I don't know if it ever got rebuilt. And here's why. The Iraqi Minister of Transportation owned the bridge. The Iraqi Minister of Oil used the bridge to run his pipelines through it. Those guys did not get along, and they could not agree themselves to rebuild the bridge and run the pipelines. Now, me, as a combat engineer, I would have thrown an expedient bridge across the top, a tactical bridge, and run the oil pipelines across the bridge and just shut it down to traffic. And the bridge simply carried pipelines on the top. That would be the easy tactical solution. Well, the more sophisticated solution was selected, and that was to drill horizontally under the river. I think it was over a dozen pipelines, different sizes, different types of products, to run under it. And there weren't any good geological surveys done under the bridge. They thought they could do it. And that cost like $50 million or more. I forget the numbers. It was in the tens of millions. And that was back then. And it took several years to even get a few of them connected. So before we destroy something in combat, understand what the secondary and tertiary impacts are going to be and what the costs are, rather than the immediate tactical gain of stopping the force. Was there another way to do it, right? In this case, dropping a bridge probably wouldn't have been that big a deal, but this was a strategic bridge because it was a third of their economy, and it was shut off, and it was shut off for a long time. And by the way, the oil that leaks out of these pipelines and was on fire flowed down the river a mile and was ingested into an Iraqi power plant, which shut down the power plant too. So there were years of problems that were created as a result of this singular attack. So war is never simple. I don't know if I properly answered the question, but I'm providing some of the context around it. So maybe there were ways to maybe crater, either side of the bridge and leaving the bridge intact. Maybe we could have seized the bridge, right? Like we seized the Mosul Dam with Army Rangers, right? Just put boots on the ground and use it as a strong point. Something like that would have probably been a better solution than what we did. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Next question is really related to the rapidity with which the Army took on the mission of guarding the infrastructure. Did you have the impression that they were quick, that it happened right away, or did it take them some time to realize that once the Iraqi army was gone, that these sites were vulnerable?
So I'm not sure I fully understand the question. What were we asking about? American forces guarding bridges? Was it the example where the Americans guarded a bridge and they left, and the next night?
Basically, how long did it take for somebody to realize there were areas that needed to be defended from attack?
Oh my gosh, it was very obvious. The fact was, it was overwhelming. There are so many pipelines and so many potential places. Just look at oil, nothing else. The oil pipelines. There was probably thousands of miles of pipelines and all kinds of particular joints and locations that are critical and key. And so we could send patrols. We could run a patrol down the pipeline, and it's all secure. But as soon as that patrol is gone, it doesn't come back for another 3 days. That's plenty of times for insurgents to get back in there and hit things. We had to get the Iraqis involved in their own security. But even that backfired on us in some ways. Here's an example. Let's say you're going to put out a contract to an Iraqi company to protect an oil pipeline. And there's 3 competing tribes where that pipeline cuts through, right? Cuts through 3 different tribal areas. Each tribe wants the contract, okay? So we do it the American way. We do it with the competition. Again, maybe it's low price, technically acceptable. I hope not. But so they award a winning Iraqi firm the security contract. Immediately, that Iraqi firm has power. It has money flowing in. It's got a lot of prestige and pride. And immediately, it's 2 competitors every day try to go out and attack the pipeline to make that winning contractor look bad and not get any benefit from being successful protecting the pipeline. So in a case like that, you kind of got to deal the money out to all of them, right? Make them all have skin in the game. Money was a weapon system on this battlefield. It can be very effective, but it also has a temporary effect. In this scene right here, we don't have the time to go into it, but in the background, on that desolate, dirt-looking hill There's some pipelines on the North Shore and a major valve that got attacked in June, July, and August of 2004 in exactly the same place. Exactly. And the oil gushed into the river, flowing down into the Beji oil refinery a mile south. It was a strategic attack. But the patrols in the area, a lot of them were Iraqis patrolling the area. They couldn't stay. We couldn't set up a camp there, right? They had to keep moving. There weren't enough military forces to protect every piece of infrastructure everywhere in the country. So it was a very tough challenge, and it can consume hundreds of thousands of people if you really want to have to protect every bridge, every pipeline, every electrical power generation or substation or power line, or, whatever it is, fiber optic cable. That can be very consuming if you rely on people. And even technology's not that good. The Air Force used to fly, the Navy used to fly fighters up and down the pipelines, kind of a show of force. At 300 or 400 knots, I doubt anybody in a fighter aircraft who's staying up high enough above small arms fire range can see people, much less tell what their intent is. Is it just a few people hanging out by the pipeline, or is it insurgents trying to do something about it? The best they could really do was report that they could see fire or a flame or smoke coming out of somewhere. It was a tough problem. It's a tough problem, and we face it. Actually, when I came back to the United States, folks from the Department of Homeland Security, the critical infrastructure folks, came to my house, and I sat down with them for hours and went through the different types of attacks that occurred in Iraq, and so that in case there were ever situations in the United States, they could benefit from those lessons learned.
Okay. And just sort of as a follow-up to that, how difficult was it? How successful? Maybe you could comment on the effort to convince the various factions in Iraq that we were actually trying to be neutral here and not play favorites among the different factions. Or were we?
Yeah. Iraq is not the United States. The people are not motivated. They're focused on, we're focused a lot of times. We look at we're Americans first, right? And then we underneath that umbrella, we may differ. Their center of gravity is at the tribe level, and loyalties are local. And I think it was very confusing mindset for Americans to go in and understand that. They think that we can motivate them in the same ways in that part of the world that we can motivate our own people. I'm not sure I have a good answer for the question. I know that understanding the culture in which you're going into and who the power brokers are is absolutely critical. You cannot, even in Afghanistan, there were 28 warlords in 28 districts, okay? And each warlord wanted to have his own police force and wanted to have his own military. So we had 28 Afghan police brigades and 28 Afghan military brigades, and each one was assigned to a different warlord. And Hamid Karzai, he was the warlord of Kabul. And if he went outside of Kabul, he was in somebody else's territory. So it's a very different mindset, and those are my just initial thoughts. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, that looks like it does it for our questions, and I think that our time is coming to an end. So I want to thank you for an outstanding presentation. I want to thank the audience for coming and joining us this evening. We did record this, and we will be putting this up on our YouTube channel for folks to listen to again and to share with their friends and anybody they think might be interested. So thank you all for coming this evening. Have a great night.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff.